Hi guys. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about some ransomware scenarios and risk analysis. So this is the video following the InfoSec course, the little InfoSec course. So I'm going to talk about, what is a ransomware to start off. Then we'll talk about data gathering, threat analysis, qualitative risk analysis, and risk scenarios. So what is a ransomware? So it's just a piece of malicious code, so a malware, that has for objectives to steal data or block access to the data unless or until a ransom is paid. So in this video, we're going to focus on the block access to the data scenario. And here it will affect the integrity and availability of the CIA triad, so the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data. So usually it's done by using some crypto lockers where data is going to be encrypted using strong algorithms and keys in order to avoid that the user can ever retrieve the data without the key, so without paying the ransom. But paying the ransom is not a guarantee that you will ever get the key to decrypt the data. So just don't count on it. And also the price is very expensive. So first, you have to have some context when you want to do a risk analysis. Why are you going to do the risk analysis, and what is what are you going to do the risk analysis on? Okay, so in my case, I've just got a NAS that is exposed over the internet. I've got some data from my family and friends that are on this NAS, and the data has to be accessible at all time. I'm also using some services and packages of Synology, and for me, the security, is a big. I'm really focusing on security. It's very important that the data is safe so that I can assure confidentiality, integrity, and availability to my family and friends. Loss of confidentiality and integrity is just unacceptable. So if you would like to be a good defender, you need to think like a hacker. Don't be just a tick box checker. Oh, there is this security function, I just need to click on it. I don't really know what it does, but it seems good, so I just click on it. No, you have to be imaginative. You need to think. Even if I've put this tick box, for example, maybe the hacker can abuse some other functions, but if he abused this function, is what I'm doing now protecting from the hacker or not? It's really a lot of imagination. That is what hackers are very good at. It's to imagine. And if you would like to protect yourself at best, you have to think like them, which is sometimes quite difficult if you're not, used to this kind of thinking. So in order to have a clear picture of the situation and your risk, you need to define what are the asset and the value, the hack value, the threat actor, the threat vector, some risk factors and vulnerabilities, what are the objectives of the attack or the attacker, what is the risk likelihood, the impact, the risk appetite and risk level, and what are you going to do for the risk treatment. So the asset and the value. So the data in my Synology is considered of being a high value to me. It's a high value, okay? But what is the real hack value for the hacker? So when we are in a crypto locker scenario, it's actually very subjective, and it really depends if you are a person of interest or not. So for myself, I'm not a person of interest, that's for sure. So let's say, what is the value of my data to the hacker? So if it's just a opportunistic attack, the value is probably low, because this person is going to attack a lot of people just to see if it's possible to attack and to grab some money from those person. But the value for him, it's low. He has no use of the data. That's the real difference. But if I am a person of interest, maybe my value will get higher because he really wants me to pay the ransom. So that's maybe a little bit different. If, for example, the hacker, what he wants is to steal some data from you, maybe your value for him is different. Now for the ease of exploit, for example, in my architecture, I can say that it's medium. It's not easy probably to destroy my infrastructure, but it shouldn't be too hard if it's a specialist, a special hacker that really wants to target me. Now, what is the result? Maybe it's a low medium. If I'm not a person of interest, it can be a medium high if I am a person of interest. But the high value can be difficult to calculate. It depends on the attacker motivation, on who you are, on what you have, and why he wants to do that. So here it's a little bit difficult for me to calculate, even for me in my situation. Now the threat. Now the threat is unauthorized access and modification of the data and data corruption. So my integrity, the data integrity gets compromised. This is the threat. Now the threat actors, who is going to attack me? So it's going to be, in my case, in my example, it's going to be a human, it's going to be malicious, and it's going to be an external person. So it can be a greedy hacker, for example, or a cyber terrorist. So the greedy hacker only does that for the money, the cyber terrorist for the money, and maybe just to destroy, because, you know, maybe you will pay, you will get the key, it will not work, or he will never send you the key. They just don't care. The cyber terrorist will maybe just want to destroy what you have, and of course make you pay. Now the threat vectors, now it's going to be more on a NAS. We're going to be centered on the NAS. So how can we infect the Synology NAS, for example? So we could insert a malicious USB key in the NAS, for example, and then it will be compromised. We can also have some internet-facing services that can be used as threat vectors. If you use some VPN services, web services, like I don't know, like you have a web server with WordPress, for example, or the Synology packages who have a web interface. You have the mail services if you're running POP, SMTP, IMAP. Those are just examples that you can have on your Synology that can be used to compromise your NAS. And of course, you've got some file services like SMB, AFP, NFS, which is of course to avoid being, you know, exposed over the internet. You've got the web dive and the Synology Drive application, which listens on the port 6690. Now, of course, there's not only the NAS that can be compromised and a ransomware be run. There is also with the computer that you can encrypt your own NAS. So for example, the hacker is going to attack your NAS through your computer with malwares, for example. So the worms, trojans, compromised executables. You can also have a malicious USB key that you will put on your computer and it will start encrypting your data. You can have drive-by downloads when you're going to browse the internet. You can have a compromission of a trusted website in which, for example, it's going to ask you to download and install a plugin, or just, you know, to initiate file downloads so you can execute and maybe compromise your system, which will then compromise your NAS. And of course, by mail, you have the phishing links and malicious attachments. Those are just some examples of what can happen. Now, for the vulnerabilities, weaknesses, and risk factors, if we still are centered now to the NAS again, you can have a unsecure architecture, for example. So you just expose your NAS over the internet without a web application firewall, without a network firewall, etc. Now you have maybe a security misconfiguration. So you've made some mistake in the WAF settings on the firewall settings, for example, or you just didn't implement any kind of security, like no antivirus, firewall, WAF, and no operating system hardening, for example. You can also have some privileges misconfiguration. which it will allow, for example, for a low user, a low grade, where you don't have administrative privilege. For example, you did not configure the privilege well, and suddenly he have access to a lot of files and folders. And if you ever get compromised, well, it will encrypt all the data that the user has access to. So be careful on the privilege that you give your users. Of course, you've got the unpatched operating system, services or packages of the NAS. They can be exploited if you do not do the updates on time. You can also have some problems with some bugs, or with applications which have lousy coding, so no security by design that is implemented in the application. And this can, in turn, you can have 0-day vulnerabilities on the operating system, service, or packages. Or also we can exploit some known vulnerabilities on the operating system or third-party packages like WordPress, for example. And then we can have SQL injection, OS command injection, broken access controls, broken authentication, and other attacks leading to RCE or privilege escalation. Those are just types of attacks that can be done if you've got some applications which are not well secured. Now it's not a vulnerability, but the authenticated or unauthenticated vulnerabilities. This is very important. If it is unauthenticated, this is extremely important that you take all the measures fast to correct or mitigate the situation, because you don't need to be authenticated as a user to exploit the system. So those are critical. Now, for a computer, what are the common vulnerabilities? Well, you can have security misconfigurations, or no security that is just not implemented, so no antivirus, no firewall, no OS hardening, for example. If you ever have permanent admin rights, so for example, usually when you have a Windows 10 computer, you are not an administrator. I mean, you are an administrator, but you have to elevate your privileges if you would like to do any administrative stuff. But if you disable the user account control because it is easier on your everyday life, well, it's like if you are a permanent admin, so malware can easily install itself and make any kind of lateral movement if needed be. So just be careful with that. And of course, if you have an unpatched operating system, well, it's an open door for please attack me. Now, what are the attack objectives of ransomwares? So first of all, it can be, a targeted attack or just an opportunistic attack because the person is scanning the entire internet and is looking for a vulnerable service. So it's the usual damage and destruction. I just don't care really about the money. I just want to destroy the data of the people. Maybe it's just I have an opportunity, like I said before, something is open, I'm just going to destroy it. And there is the usual ransom and blackmail that you are going to have in a ransomware scenario. So please pay 5 bitcoins in the next 24 hours, otherwise it will be 20 bitcoins, and after 1 week the key will be deleted and you will never get your data again. So if the hacker is honest, maybe he will provide you the key after the payment, and if he's a good hacker, the key will work, because in some certain scenarios the key does not work, or the software used to decrypt does not work, or maybe he just lied to you and there are no such things as key to decrypt your data. So you paid and you lost your data. Now, for the risk appetite on my side, for example, it's low. I don't want to accept any kind of risk. Most of them, if I find, I'm going to treat them. Of course, maybe there are some I cannot because it would be too expensive or just impossible. But my risk appetite is low. Now, if we talk about qualitative risk analysis, so as I said, it is more of a subjective way of doing the risk analysis, it is based on experience and on the history of your company or on yourself, for example. So there's no real value. It's just really subjective. So what is my the risk likelihood and impact? For example, I've got no security controls. Okay, so I've got no secure architecture. I'm not using any kind of best practices. My exposure is, to the internet. It's easy to exploit if someone wanted to attack me. I'm going to say that we are not targeted, so we have an opportunistic attack maybe going on that or will go on. My asset value for myself is high. I've got no backup. So now the impact is high. If this ever happens, I will have a loss of productivity and a loss of data and a problem with my family and friends. So here, if you can see in the risk matrix, you have the likelihood, you have the consequences, so negligible, moderate, catastrophic, and now my likelihood is high because of all what I've just said, and the consequences is catastrophic. Why? Because I've just got no backup and I will lose some data. Okay, so for me, the priority of to treat the risk is high. I need to do something fast. Okay, now I've put some okay security controls. I've put some, not all. I've done some effort, for example. So I have implemented a partially for the best practices and a secure architecture. I'm still exposed to the internet. The ease of exploit is then suddenly medium and not easy anymore. The type of attack is still opportunistic. My asset value is high. I've still got no backup, but the impact is still high. If it ever happens, I'm going to have loss of data, loss of productivity. But now, because I've done some changes, let's say that the likelihood is maybe lower, but the consequences is still catastrophic. So I've said that the priority of the risk for treatment is medium. Well, let's say it's medium high. Now I've got a good security controls in place and I've got some backups. So am I having a secure architecture and I'm using best practices? Yes. I'm still over the internet. The ease of exploit is still medium. Opportunistic attacks, high value asset, backup, yes. Now the impact, let's say it's medium. I will still have a loss of productivity and loss of data. But I can say that the impact is medium because even if it happens, I've got my backup. So it's less critical. So the likelihood and risk is moderate, for example. And if I would like to treat the residual risk, for example, it will be a low to medium priority task. So this is just to show you maybe how you can construct your little cells, your table, just to see the likelihood, the impact, where am I in this little tab. So it's just to show you how you can do things. Now the risk treatment, so I can, in my case, I can accept the risk or the remainder of the risk. I can mitigate the risk with some technical security controls, but in my case it will be a mix of both, of course, because I cannot mitigate all risks. So I need to accept them, otherwise I would need to avoid them and stop doing what I'm doing. And for the rest, I'm going to try to reduce the likelihood and the impact of the risk. And this will be the subject of my next video. Is going to implement technical security controls. And now you've got different kinds of access control. You've got prevention, protection, detection, response, and recovery. So I probably do one video of each. Now for the risk scenario. So a risk scenario is a description of a security event that can lead to a business impact. So you've got to use all the information mentioned before to create your risk scenarios. It will allow you to have a better understanding and so a better picture of the current risk exposure that you have today. And now it gets real. Now you've put everything on the table and you see that now, yes, you have some risk and you need to treat them because you've got some vulnerabilities that you need to address, for example. So let's see now with the CORAS methodology, which will allow us to modelize our risks scenarios. Okay, so you've got to start with two things. First, so here you've got your asset, which you have to put. So this will be the data in our NAS. And here we have our threat actor. Okay, let's say threat actor. So he's human, he's malicious, and he's external. So what is the biggest risk if we have a ransomware targeting us? Okay, so we're going to have a risk here. The risk is that we are going to lose the integrity and availability of our data. How is that possible? We will have two kinds of incident. We'll have this incident here, which will allow the ransomware to encrypt the data of only one user. And we're going to have here our second incident where the ransomware is going to be able to encrypt the data of all the users. Okay, so let's talk about the first one where it's going to encrypt only one user data. Okay, so here we've got our threat here. The threat is that the ransomware is going to encrypt our data. Okay, and this is caused by a user executing a malware. And how was that possible? It's because we don't have any antivirus. Okay, so this is the chain that allowed the user data to be compromised. Now let's see for this one. We've got here another vulnerability. Okay, so we've got our ransomware, which is going to encrypt our data, and maybe we have some privileges, misconfigurations by the administrator, for example, and one user has a lot of privileges. Okay, so it can access a lot of data. And because of that, it is going to be able to encrypt all user data or, the data of other users. So this is how this happened because of this chained vulnerability. Now, what do we have? Now let's talk about the second line. For example, we have an unpatched system or package. The threat is that our system is going to be compromised via an remote code execution or SQL injection vulnerability, for example. Then the ransomware, the threat is that it's going to be able to start encrypting. Now it is either going to encrypt a specific folder. For example, if you've got a web service, so your NAS was compromised through the web service that was exposed over the internet, and maybe it's not going to go and encrypt more folders than the folder of the technical user which is running the web service, for example. But now, if you're chaining this with this vulnerability of a broken access control vulnerability, for example, it's going to be able to encrypt multiple users' data, for example, or maybe the entire system, for example. Now, what do we've got? For the last scenario, we've got, for example, maybe one user data or all user data, which is going to be encrypted with a ransomware, as usual, okay? Now, this was possible because we had another threat and because the account, one account or multiple accounts, they were compromised. And how did that happen? Because we had a vulnerability here, because we had a weak password, because we never had any kind of password policies. But how did this happen? It happened because our IT staff doesn't know how to implement a firewall, a password. Oh, I said to implement password policy. Yes, they don't know how to do it. And this was possible because they do not have any competence in this field, for example, okay? So as you can see, the external attacker was able to leverage the fact that we had no antivirus, for example, that we had vulnerabilities in our OS or packages because we never patched it, and because we have a lack of competence in IT. So those three vulnerabilities, we had some scenarios where we were able to encrypt user data, a specific user or multiple users, okay? Now, how can you correct all this? You can correct this because, for example, for the user executing malware, you can correct it by having an antivirus on the system, okay? Or also by using to train your users, but this is not a problem of the antivirus vulnerability. So you've got to install an antivirus. Now the system was compromised with an RCE or SQL, so you can update the operating system and the packages, and implement, for example, a web application firewall to try to mitigate the risk. Okay. Then what do we have? I did not, for privilege misconfiguration, also for this part is, well, to correctly configure your privileges, for example. Maybe here a little box in this area is missing, but that's not important in this case. And we have, for example, if our IT staff doesn't know how to implement a password policy, well, then we have to train them. And if we would like to protect ourselves of the account ever getting compromised, then we have to implement a password policy, implement the IP ban feature, for example, and the account lockout feature in the Synology. So this is what I wanted to present you with the CORAS methodology. I hope this video has been informative for you, and if you have any kind of questions, feel free to ask, and if I can, I will try to answer them for you. Thank you, and bye-bye.